Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao canal Inglês de Verdade. Hoje você ouvirá um pequeno podcast para testar seu listening em inglês. Após ouvi-lo, você responderá 5 perguntas sobre o assunto falado para testar a sua compreensão. Fazendo isso, além de praticar seu listening, você ainda vai ganhar vocabulário em inglês. Caso queira, você pode ativar a legenda em inglês que está disponível no vídeo. Então, vamos começar.
Okay, let's try a quick thought experiment. Right now, wherever you are listening, just stop for a second and listen. What's the quietest sound you can actually hear? Maybe it's, I don't know, the fridge buzzing, air conditioning hum, some traffic way off in the distance.
Right, there's always something.
Exactly. Now imagine you could just switch all of that off. Total silence. Would that finally be peaceful?
It's funny you ask that because we talk about silence all the time, but what we usually mean is just low-level noise. In our world today, true quiet doesn't really exist, does it?
No, our ears are always picking something up.
Constantly saturated, yeah. Even if you find a place you think is quiet, sound is still bouncing around, carrying energy, giving your brain sensory information. Real, absolute silence. That's something totally alien to us as humans.
And that difference, that gap between just less noise and actual acoustic silence. That's exactly what we're diving into today. We want to understand these special places, these anechoic chambers, that are built specifically to eliminate every single external sound.
Engineered for it.
Right. What happens to your mind, when you take away that fundamental sense, hearing? And why does it go from maybe peaceful to, well, deeply disturbing, apparently?
It's a fascinating question.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So, before we even get to the experience inside, we kind of have to understand what they're trying to build. Achieving absolute silence isn't just about, say, making the walls really thick.
Like soundproofing.
Exactly. That gives you sound insulation, it keeps outside noise out. But anechoic silence means stopping sound reflection. Echo. Completely.
Ah, right. And anechoic literally means no echo. So why is getting rid of the echo the key thing, more than just blocking outside sound?
Well, think about it. Any hard surface walls, floor, ceiling reflect sound waves back at you, even if the sound starts inside the room with you.
Okay.
So if you clap your hands in your living room, you hear the clap, sure, but you also hear all those tiny, almost instant echoes bouncing off everything.
Right, the room has a sound.
It does. To get true acoustic neutrality, you need a space where sound waves basically just die. They hit a surface and vanish.
Like an acoustic black hole, where sound just goes in and doesn't come out.
That's a great way to put it. And the way they build these rooms is all about achieving that.
Yeah, the pictures look pretty wild.
They do. The classic design involves lining everything, halls, ceiling, even the floor, which is usually like a mesh grid you walk on with these huge wedge-shaped things.
Made of foam or fiberglass?
Yeah, special high-density acoustic foam or fiberglass. But it's not just soft padding. The shape, those wedges, that's absolutely crucial.
Okay, why the wedges? What does that shape actually do to the sound?
So when a sound wave hits the point of a wedge, it doesn't just bounce off a flat surface. Instead, it travels deeper into the wedge's structure.
Okay.
And as it goes deeper, the shape and the material itself, they sort of gradually trap the wave. It gets refracted, absorbed, its energy just fizzles out.
So it can't reflect back out.
Almost entirely gone. Like 99.9% of the sound energy gets absorbed. There's basically zero acoustic feedback in the room.
And the most famous one, the quietest place on Earth, according to the records. That's in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
At Microsoft.
That's the one. Yeah, the chamber at Microsoft headquarters in Redmond, Washington. It holds the Guinness World Record. The measurement they got is, it's pretty mind-bending. Minus 20.6 decibels.
Minus 20.6 dB. Okay, we need to stop there for a second because most people think 0 dB is like total silence at the bottom. What does a negative decibel number even mean?
Right, it's confusing. So in standard acoustics, 0 dB is defined as the threshold of human hearing. It's the absolute faintest sound a perfect human ear could theoretically detect.
Okay, baseline.
Exactly. So to measure a negative number like negative 20.6 dB, it means the background vibration, the ambient sound energy in that room, is actually lower than what our biology can even perceive.
Wow.
It's quieter than silence, in a way. It goes beyond the limits of what our brains are naturally wired to process as sound input. It's genuinely an environment of non-sound.
That really sets up the paradox, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You go into this place, engineered to be quieter than humanly possible, and you'd expect, I don't know, instant calm, maybe deep meditation.
That's the expectation, yeah. People think tranquility.
But the sources we looked at suggest it's
Yeah.
pretty much the opposite.
It really is. You might feel okay for a minute or two, but then it shifts quickly towards intense discomfort, even anxiety.
Because when you remove all the external sound, what happens?
Well, the volume dial doesn't just go to zero. It sort of flips inward. The sound source becomes you.
You become intensely aware of the loudest thing left in the room, which is your own body. You suddenly hear all the mechanical bits keeping you alive.
It's genuinely shocking how noisy we are internally. Our brains are constantly filtering out this body noise so we can function. Take away the external input and suddenly you hear it all.
What kind of sounds? Like your heartbeat.
Oh yeah, the heartbeat is often the first thing people notice. It stops being this background rhythm and becomes this loud physical thump, thump, thump that just dominates everything.
Okay, I can kind of imagine that. But what about the other stuff? The sources mentioned hearing blood flow.
Yes, that seems to be one of the most unnerving things for people. You can apparently hear the actual sound of your blood moving through your veins and arteries.
What does that sound like?
People describe it as like a high-pitched whoosh, or maybe a kind of constant static or hiss. Some said like a torrential river inside them. It's always there, but our brain just screens it out.
Until it can't anymore.
Right. When there's nothing else to focus on, that filtering mechanism seems to just collapse.
And even just breathing, something we never hear normally.
Becomes incredibly loud, like bellows or a rush of air going in and out. You're suddenly tuned in to every little involuntary biological function. It's intense.
Yeah, that's not just the sounds, is it? There are neurological effects, too. Losing the external sound cues messes with your brain.
Profoundly, yeah. When your brain loses all those sounds bouncing off surfaces, especially the reflections, it loses its sense of space. It's grounding.
How does hearing normally help us with space? I mean, I know it helps locate things, but...
We use sound reflection constantly, usually unconsciously, to map the room around us. Tiny changes in frequency tell us how far away a wall is, the slight difference in sound off a carpet versus a hard floor.
Okay.
It's like a passive sonar system, constantly calibrating our balance and our orientation in 3 dimensions.
So when the chamber removes all the reflections, that calibration system just fails. Is that why people feel dizzy?
Absolutely. The brain's suddenly missing critical orientation data. People report feeling intensely dizzy, disoriented. Some find it hard to even stand up straight for very long without feeling like they'll fall over.
Losing your sense of up and down.
Yeah, and just awareness of where your body is in space, that sense called proprioception, gets severely messed up.
And then the brain, starved for input, starts making things up. Is that where the hallucinations come in?
Seems like it. The mind needs input to confirm reality, right? So when it's getting nothing from the ears, it can start generating its own sounds. Phantom ringing, buzzing, maybe distorted music, even voices sometimes.
Wow.
It's like the brain is trying to draw the map that should be there because the main tool for drawing its sound has been taken away.
And the record for staying in that Microsoft chamber is supposedly only, what, 45 minutes?
Yeah, about that. And even that short time is apparently enough to cause significant sensory disruption and tricks of the mind.
So what's fascinating here is the body actively pushes back against this supposedly perfect silence. It proves we actually need that constant background noise to stay grounded.
It really does. It overwhelms us precisely by removing the input we rely on. It highlights that paradox. Extreme external silence becomes, in a weird way, internally deafening.
Okay, so it's clearly not a pleasant place for humans to hang out. But it turns out this level of extreme quiet is incredibly important for the machines and technology that shape our world. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right. The main practical use for these anechoic chambers is acoustic testing. Industries spend a lot of money building these things because any background noise, any echo, messes up precise measurements.
They need to isolate the product itself.
Exactly. To measure only the sound the product makes, or maybe how well it captures sound, without any interference.
So what are some examples? We mentioned speakers earlier, obviously.
Yeah, speakers are a classic one. But think about really sensitive stuff like hearing aids or high-end microphones for recording studios or scientific instruments.
Okay.
You need to know exactly how much noise the device itself makes internally versus the signal it's supposed to pick up or produce. That signal-to-noise ratio. If you test that in a regular room,
The room's sound messes up the results.
totally corrupts the data. You can't tell what's the product and what's the room.
Nice
So the
stuff.
chamber gives you that clean baseline.
Makes sense. And what about electric vehicles? You hear about them being tested in these chambers too. Why cars?
Well, it's because electric motors are so much quieter than old combustion engines, right?
Yeah, almost silent sometimes.
So in a gas car, the engine noise kind of masks all the other little sounds. Tire noise, wind noise, the air conditioning fan, maybe little creaks from the suspension.
You didn't notice them as much.
Exactly. But in an EV, suddenly those little sounds become really obvious and potentially annoying to the driver. So car companies use these chambers to pinpoint exactly where those sounds are coming from,
And then engineer them out.
or redesign the parts to be quieter. It's all about achieving that premium, quiet ride experience that EV buyers expect. It's noise reduction engineering.
Huh. And the sources also mention space technology. That seems surprising. Why test something going into the vacuum of space in a super quiet room on Earth?
That's a cool one. So satellites and space probes often carry really sensitive instruments, right? Designed to detect faint signals or vibrations out in space.
Okay.
Before they launch the satellite, they might put it in an anechoic chamber here on Earth to measure its own internal noise. The faint hum from its computers, the whir of tiny pumps or gyroscopes.
Ah, so they know the satellite's own sound fingerprint.
Precisely. So that when it's up in orbit and detects some tiny vibration or sound, they know if it's actually coming from space or just from the satellite itself buzzing away. It's about calibrating for absolute zero interference.
That idea of calibrating zero ties back nicely to the more philosophical idea we talked about earlier, doesn't it? Sound as a fundamental reference point.
It does. In engineering, they use the chamber to define a technical zero point for sound measurement.
But stepping back from the tech, this whole experience of forced silence, it does raise some pretty deep questions about us, about our nature.
Definitely. We rely so much on that background soundscape just to feel normal, situated. When it vanishes, we feel weirdly exposed, almost vulnerable.
It suggests noise isn't just annoying background stuff. It's almost like a necessary buffer between our inner world and the outer world.
That's a good way to think about it. A psychological barrier, maybe? And losing it doesn't bring peace like you might expect, but this strange kind of loneliness or even anguish.
Which brings us to that other kind of silence the sources touched on, the kind people actively seek out, like in spiritual traditions.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this raises an important question. Why do monks, for example, seek silence if this absolute acoustic silence is so, well, mentally damaging?
It's because they're not looking for the same thing, are they? They're not after acoustic zero.
No, they're pursuing what's sometimes called interior silence. They're trying to quiet the mental noise.
The internal chatter, the constant thinking, planning, worrying.
Exactly, all that internal static. The goal is to reduce that noise to achieve a state of clarity, focus, maybe pure perception. They're trying to master the internal stimuli, not eliminate the external ones.
That's a really crucial difference.
It is. The scientific challenge is removing external sound to study physics or engineering. The spiritual journey is about managing internal sound to understand consciousness.
But both paths recognize that getting clarity, or precision, means getting rid of certain kinds of noise. They just target opposite sources outside versus inside.
Well put, yeah.
It's quite an insight, actually. It brings this whole deep dive together. We live in this incredibly noisy world, and we think, if only it were quiet, equating silence with peace.
A common assumption.
But the reality, shown by these anechoic chambers, is that absolute external silence isn't some peaceful haven. It's more like an extreme biological edge. It forces you right up against the sheer volume and complexity of your own physical being.
It reminds us that we are never truly silent ourselves. The machinery is always running, the heart's always beating, the blood's always rushing. We are inherently noisy creatures.
Okay, so if we accept that our bodies are just fundamentally noisy, like this constant internal soundtrack, what does it really mean when we try to know thyself without any external distractions? Are we maybe just built to need a certain level of external noise, almost to distract us from the overwhelming sound of simply being alive?
E aí, como foi o desafio de hoje? Conseguiu entender bem o podcast? Se sim, parabéns! Seu listening está evoluindo. E se não, não tem problema. O importante é praticar sempre. Aproveita e comenta aqui embaixo qual parte você achou mais difícil ou qual palavra nova aprendeu hoje. Ah, e claro, deixa o like, se inscreve no canal e ativa o sininho para continuar treinando inglês de um jeito leve e natural. Nos vemos no próximo vídeo do Inglês de Verdade.
E se você assistiu até aqui e quer aprender inglês sem gastar um centavo durante todo o processo de aprendizagem, com acesso a ferramentas, atalhos e mentoria que vai fazer com que você absorva o inglês de forma rápida e natural, eu te convido a conhecer o método dos 9 Passos para a Fluência, onde você vai conhecer a forma correta de aprender um inglês.
Good. Now we can go in the water.
Com acesso a ferramentas que irão te auxiliar nesse aprendizado. E o melhor, todas encontradas de forma gratuita. E entre essas ferramentas, uma você usará para manter contato com nativos do inglês para que sua prática de conversação seja mais eficaz. Porque nada melhor do que absorver o inglês diretamente da fonte. E quando eu digo que essas ferramentas são gratuitas, eu não quero dizer que apenas o primeiro mês será grátis, como degustação. E que se você quiser continuar usando, você terá que pagar. Todas as ferramentas que serão apresentadas a você nesse método são gratuitas para o resto da vida, até quando você quiser usar. Esse método é perfeito para você que não tem ideia de como e por onde começar e para você que já tem um conhecimento em inglês, mas ainda não conquistou a fluência. Nele você será apresentado a atalhos que vão acelerar seu aprendizado que estudantes que estão começando não fazem ideia que existem. 99% das pessoas que colocarem esse método em prática, seguindo passo a passo, conseguirão realizar seu sonho de se tornar fluente em inglês. Então, se você acha que finalmente chegou a hora de realizar seu sonho e dominar de vez o inglês, clique no primeiro link da descrição, que eu tenho certeza que você não vai se arrepender.